The card was still warm from his coat pocket when he set it on the table. Nobody in the room understood yet what it meant. 6 minutes earlier, a security guard had reached for his arm. Now the same guard stood frozen by the door, waiting for a word that would not come. A man in a gray suit was already reaching for his phone to call a lawyer who could not help him. A woman at the head of the table was staring at a signature she did not remember signing, and somewhere beyond the glass wall, a 6-year-old girl was still holding a stuffed rabbit, waiting to find out if her father was in trouble or if the world had simply been wrong about him all along. 14 hours earlier. The morning came into downtown Chicago the color of dishwater, the kind of gray that made the glass towers along the river look like they were holding their breath. Solace Tower stood 41 stories over Wacker Drive, its lobby floor polished to a shine that swallowed footsteps whole. Analysts in tailored coats crossed toward the elevator bank without looking at each other, badges already scanned, minds already 3 meetings ahead. Almost nobody working there that morning remembered why the company had been built, or that it had ever been built for anything other than the numbers on the screen behind the front desk. A man in a charcoal coat came through the revolving door a few minutes past 8. He was 30 years old, tall, with the kind of tired that had nothing to do with sleep. His shirt was clean, but a little wrinkled at the collar. His shoes were good leather, worn soft at the heel. In one hand he carried a battered folder. In the other, the small hand of a 6-year-old girl in a pale blue coat, her hair still flattened on one side from the car ride. She looked up at the letters mounted above the security desk and read them slowly to herself. "Daddy," she said, "is this the place Mommy used to talk about?" Caleb Whitfield did not answer right away. He had not stood in this lobby in 5 years. He nodded once and held her hand a little tighter. Behind the front desk, Louise Sanders looked up from her monitor. She was 58, silver-haired, with reading glasses pushed up into her part. Her hands went still on the keyboard the moment she saw him, though she said nothing. She had worked security intake at Solace Tower long enough to know that some men only walked back through their own front doors as strangers, and that there was usually a reason for it. Caleb told her he had an interview scheduled for an entry-level operations analyst position. The name on her screen was not his real name. Louise printed a visitor badge, clipped it, and slid it across the counter without a flicker of recognition crossing her face. She gestured toward a long bench near the elevators. He thanked her and walked Nora over, and they sat. At first, Nora watched the elevators rise and fall, counting the little numbers over each door. After 20 minutes, her curiosity thinned into restlessness. People in good coats passed without a glance. A young assistant clocked Caleb's worn shoes on her way by and looked somewhere else instead. 40 minutes. An hour. Nobody offered them water. Nobody asked the child if she was hungry. Caleb pulled a small packet of crackers from his coat pocket and handed it to her, and she ate carefully, though a few crumbs fell onto the marble. A passing woman with a tablet under her arm frowned down at the mess. "This isn't a daycare," she said, not quite to either of them, and kept walking. Caleb knelt without a word and gathered the crumbs into his palm. Nora watched him do it and did not ask why. Beyond a wall of glass, 40 feet from where they sat, the executive floor was already in session. Simone Ashford sat at the head of a long table, 28 years old, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her expression carefully arranged into something that could pass for calm. To her right, Preston Vale turned a fountain pen between 2 fingers like a small patient instrument. Across from him, Grady Cole leaned back in his chair with the loose confidence of a man who had never once doubted that a room belonged to him. Grady's eyes drifted through the glass and landed on the man on the bench and the girl beside him. His mouth curled. "Another desperate father," he said, just loud enough to be heard by the 2 directors nearest him, who thinks a wrinkled shirt is a resume. A few of them laughed, quietly, the way people laugh when they think no one outside the joke can hear it. Nora heard it anyway. She lowered her head and pressed the rabbit harder against her chest. Caleb did not look up. His fingers closed slowly around the edge of the leather folder, the way a man closes his hand around something he has already decided not to use yet. 10 years earlier, none of this glass had existed. There had only been a rented garage outside Dayton, Ohio, with a leaking roof and 2 space heaters that never quite kept up with winter. Caleb had grown up in that part of the state, the son of a machinist and a home health aide, the kind of household where nobody had money to spare and everybody worked nights. He'd earned his engineering degree on scholarship and 3 part-time jobs, and the thing he had always believed, the thing that never left him, was that a machine only earned the right to exist if it served somebody who had no other options. His first design had been a portable dialysis unit small enough and cheap enough to run in a rural clinic that couldn't afford a hospital-grade machine. He had met Vivian in the break room of a county hospital outside Dayton. She wasn't an engineer, and she didn't know the first thing about raising capital, but she believed him when his first investor turned him down flat, and she was the one who looked across their kitchen table and said, simply, "If it keeps a dialysis chair running in a town with 1 doctor, it's worth finishing." When the rent came due that spring, she sold her car to cover it. Desmond Doyle had been Caleb's closest friend since sophomore year of college, a quiet, blunt-spoken engineer whose loyalty never announced itself. It just showed up and stayed. The 3 of them slept on the garage floor those first winters. They ate cold food out of cans. They rebuilt circuit boards at 3 in the morning by the light of a single work lamp, running on nothing but a shared, stubborn belief that the machine could work, in a field full of serious people who kept telling them it couldn't. When the prototype finally held a steady flow rate for 6 straight hours, Solace Health was born. The trade press called Caleb a young genius. He always corrected them. The company had been built by Vivian's stubbornness, by Desmond's patience, and by the 2 of them refusing to leave when leaving would have been the easier, smarter choice. Then, the bad year came. Nora was barely a year old when Vivian died of a postpartum complication that had nothing merciful in it at all. 11 months later, Desmond was killed in an equipment failure at a remote testing lab in Wisconsin. 2 losses inside a single year, and Caleb no longer had the strength left to stand at the center of anything. He stepped back. He handed daily operations to Preston Vale, to Grady Cole, to a leadership team Desmond himself had helped recruit years earlier. He kept his controlling stake. He kept the founder's emergency clause buried deep in the corporate charter, the way a man keeps a spare key he never expects to need. Then he disappeared from public view for 5 years and became, to the world, the recluse who had walked away from his own company. To Nora, he was simply the man who braided her hair before school and made the 2 of them simple dinners she was allowed to help stir. The night the email came, the house outside the city was quiet. Nora was already asleep, the rabbit tucked under her chin. Caleb sat at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold, watching an old video clip on his laptop, Vivian in the first garage, dust on her hands, laughing, telling him that one day Solace machines would be running in clinics the rest of the country had stopped thinking about. A message blinked in the corner of the screen. The sender was blank. The subject line was a single sentence. "They're selling what she died believing in." Caleb stared at those words for a long time before he opened the attachment. Inside were 22 files, closed session minutes, side letters, budget transfers, an almost finished acquisition agreement with a pharmaceutical conglomerate called Ashgrove Biomedical Holdings. Caleb read until the sky outside the kitchen window began to turn pale, and the picture that formed was patient and cold in a way he hadn't expected even from Preston. Ashgrove had been circling Solace for 2 years. The offer on the table was nearly 40% below the company's true value. Once the sale closed, Ashgrove intended to shelve every low-cost dialysis and insulin delivery patent the company held, not to build on them, but to keep them off the market entirely so that no competitor could ever undercut Ashgrove's premium device line again. Every rural clinic contract Vivian had personally fought for would be quietly discontinued within 18 months. None of it had ever been a line item to her. It had been the entire reason the company existed. Preston Vale stood to receive a personal payout of $91 million the moment the Ashgrove deal closed. Grady Cole had been promised a board seat on the acquiring company, along with an equity package that would vest the day the ink dried. Worse than either of those numbers was the pattern behind them. For the better part of 18 months, The two of them had been quietly starving the research division of funding, canceling small clinic partnerships one at a time, making the company look weak enough on paper to justify selling it cheap. The anonymous sender was a mid-level financial analyst named Owen Marsh, 31 years old, who had noticed irregularities while reconciling vendor accounts, traced a set of shell payments back through 3 shifting entity names, and finally understood that he had nowhere internal left to bring it. Caleb did not call the press, because public noise would only give Preston time to bury the paper trail. He did not call the board either, because he still didn't know how many of them had already been bought. He decided the only way to see what the company had actually become was to walk into it himself, as nobody at all. That morning, Nora had watched him take an old charcoal coat out of the back of the closet, the same coat he'd worn to his very first investor pitch. She'd asked where he was going. He told her he had business downtown. She'd asked if she could come, since school was closed for a teacher conference, and when he started to say no, she said instead, "Mommy said, this company is part of our family too." The sentence landed somewhere in him he'd been avoiding for 5 years. He brought her because she was, in the end, the reason he could no longer let her mother's name be sold out from under her without at least standing in the room to watch it happen. Now, on the bench, an hour into the wait, Caleb watched the small cruelties of the building accumulate one after another. An older custodian was told to work faster and clear the hallway before an investor tour came through. A young assistant was corrected in front of the whole lobby for printing a folder cover in the wrong shade of blue. A lab technician in a white coat was stopped by security from boarding the executive elevator, the guard explaining, not unkindly, that there were important guests on the floor that morning. Caleb watched these small scenes and felt something in them that no spreadsheet in Owen's files had managed to make him feel. The culture inside this building had shifted, somewhere in the last 5 years, from respecting people to performing importance. Nora leaned close to him. "Why does nobody smile here, Daddy?" He didn't have a true answer. "They're busy, sweetheart," he said gently, though he knew the word for it wasn't busy. It was coldness, dressed up as discipline. Through the glass wall, Preston was presenting what he called a strategic realignment. He used careful language, portfolio optimization, shareholder protection, reduced research exposure, and underneath every phrase sat the same plain fact. He was selling the company. Simone sat at the head of the table because the board had wanted a young, sharp face for the press during a delicate transition, and she genuinely believed she was steering the company through one. She did not know that Preston had shown her only cleaned summaries, or that the harder clauses lived in appendices she had never been given. When her eyes drifted through the glass and landed on the man with a child beside him, her expression tightened with the small displeasure of someone who thought this was unprofessional. Preston noticed her face and used it. "That kind of sentimentality," he said quietly, "was the weakness of the old founder era. Too many family stories." This company finally grew up. Simone said nothing. She had been told too many times by older men that softness was a liability she couldn't afford, and she had spent years teaching herself to run colder than the room around her, certain it was the only road to being taken seriously. She had not yet noticed how much that coldness had begun to blind her. Nearly an hour had passed. Nora was tired and hungry and trying very hard not to be a bother. When the low laughter came again through the glass, she felt small in a way she had never quite felt before. She tugged her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "do they not like us?" The question hit Caleb harder than any insult aimed at himself ever could have. He could survive mockery pointed at him. He was not prepared for his daughter to learn, on an ordinary Tuesday, that her father deserved to be treated this way. Caleb opened the folder in his lap while Nora's attention drifted back to the elevators and turned to the final page of the timeline Owen had sent, the one he hadn't let himself read closely until now. It was a signing schedule. The Ashgrove agreement was calendared for final execution the next morning at 9 in this building, on this floor. Not next month, not next quarter, tomorrow. Caleb sat very still on the bench, the folder open on his knee, and understood that whatever he was going to do, He had less than a day left to do it. Grady Cole stepped out of the conference room a few minutes later with two directors trailing behind him and walked slowly toward the bench where Caleb and Nora sat. He stopped in front of them, hands in his pockets, in no hurry at all. "You're the analyst candidate?" he asked. "I am," Caleb said evenly. Grady's eyes moved from Caleb's worn shoes to Nora and back again. "Friendly advice," he said, loud enough to carry across the lobby. "If you want anyone here to believe you have a future, don't bring a small child to a corporate interview, and don't wear a suit that looks like it came out of a donation bin." A few people nearby laughed, not loudly, but in a quiet lobby the sound traveled anyway. Nora's face went hot. "Daddy's suit isn't ugly," she said, her voice shaking. Somewhere in the room, a grown man should have been ashamed of himself. Grady only laughed harder. At least the kid's loyal. Nora's eyes filled, and she bent her head so the rabbit covered half her face. Caleb set his hand on her shoulder, and his silence changed shape. It was no longer the silence of a man watching. It was the silence of a man who had just finished deciding something. Simone came out of the conference room because the noise had started drawing attention from the floor above. She looked at Caleb. She looked at Nora. Something flickered across her face for half a second, as though the cold layer over it had been touched somewhere underneath. But Preston was standing just behind her, watching how she handled it, and she was a young woman who had spent every working day of her career refusing to look uncertain. "Sir," she said, her voice level, "this is the executive floor. If you can't keep your child settled, we're going to need to ask you to leave." Caleb looked at her without raising his voice. "Is that the professional word," he asked, "for letting a 6-year-old hear a grown man mock her father?" The question went somewhere Simone hadn't let anyone touch in years, and instead of an answer, she chose composure, the expensive kind. Grady turned to a nearby security officer. "Escort him out." 2 guards stepped forward. Nora gasped and pressed her face into her father's coat. Caleb crouched to her eye level and wiped a tear from her cheek with the side of his thumb. "Stay with Miss Louise for a minute," he said softly. "Daddy isn't going to let this be your worst memory of this place." The guards closed the last few feet of distance. Caleb didn't resist. He looked once at Simone and asked, quietly enough that only the people closest could hear, "Is the meeting to approve the sale of this company already underway upstairs?" Every voice near the desk dropped out at once. Simone's eyes sharpened. "Excuse me?" Caleb didn't answer. He unclipped the visitor badge from around his neck and pressed it gently into Louise's open palm. Then he looked down at Nora, and Louise came around the desk without being asked and held out her hand to the little girl. "Stay with me, sweetheart," she said. "Your daddy knows exactly what he's doing." Nora was still frightened, but she nodded and let go of Caleb's hand. Caleb stood. Grady gestured for the guards to move. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small black card, unmarked except for a raised authentication seal, the kind issued only to a founder and controlling shareholder. The lead guard glanced at it, and his whole posture changed. He stepped back immediately. Grady's voice rose, sharp and fast. "What are you doing? Stop him! Nobody move!" Caleb pushed open the door of the conference room, and the entire upper leadership of Solace Health was inside, waiting for him without knowing it. Preston Vale, Grady Cole, Simone Ashford, following 2 steps behind, still trying to catch up with a room that had already started moving, legal counsel, 2 board members, 3 senior officers, 2 representatives from Ashgrove Biomedical, seated at the far end with the final draft of the agreement spread out in front of them, waiting on signatures. Grady followed him in, trying to recover the room by force of volume alone. "You have no right to be in here." Caleb didn't look at him. He crossed the length of the table to the seat at its head, the one that had been left empty out of old habit nobody had ever bothered to fill, and set his leather folder down. The sound of it landing was small. It was also absolute. Preston Vale turned toward the noise, annoyed for exactly 2 seconds, and then his face went white. He had seen that jaw before, that stillness. That particular pair of eyes he had once told a room full of reporters had walked away from this company for good. and his fingers, still holding the fountain pen he'd been turning between them all morning, went completely still against the table. Callista. Simone did not understand yet what she was looking at. She only saw the man she had ordered removed from her lobby less than a minute ago, now standing at the head of her boardroom table with a calm that was not hers to give away. Caleb opened the folder. He took out the founder's authentication card and laid it flat beside Preston's finished draft. The card was black, engraved in clean white letters: Caleb Whitfield, founder. Controlling shareholder. Charter authority holder. Legal counsel rose so fast his own pen rolled off the table and onto the floor. Simone's face went pale looking at the card. Grady's mouth opened and closed without producing a single word. Caleb spoke to no one in particular, his voice even unhurried. "I sat on a bench outside that door for an hour," he said. "Long enough to understand this company isn't only being sold. It's already been hollowed out from the inside." The silence that followed wasn't a pause. It was the sound of a room realizing the ground under it had already moved. What came next took 6 minutes. People who had been in that room would later describe it the way survivors describe a very precise storm. No shouting, no theatrics, just the steady hand of a man who had decided that the time for waiting was finished. In the first minute, counsel ran Caleb's card against the company's authentication system, and it confirmed exactly what the card claimed. Preston tried to push back, said smoothly that a man absent from operations for 5 years had no standing to interfere now. Caleb didn't raise his voice. "I don't need a corner office to know when a company's being betrayed." In the second minute, he opened the Ashgrove agreement to the page listing the transaction price, nearly 40% under true value, and when an Ashgrove representative reached for the document, Caleb set his hand flat on it instead. "Don't touch it. The original's already sitting in 3 law firms." In the third minute, he exposed Preston directly, laying out the $91 million personal payout agreement, then a second sheet showing wire transfers to a consulting entity whose registered address matched Preston's brother-in-law's home. Preston tried to laugh it off as a post-merger advisory arrangement. Caleb turned the page calmly to an email in Preston's own words, instructing a deputy that the company's numbers needed to look softer before signing. A director near the far end of the table stood to leave. Caleb didn't even look up. "Sit down. Your name's on page 14. The director sat. In the fourth minute, he laid out Grady's contribution. The systematic research cuts, the quietly discontinued clinic contracts, redirected funds landing in affiliated subcontractor accounts. Grady lost his composure entirely, shouting that Caleb had abandoned the company and had no right to judge the people who'd stayed. Caleb looked at him directly for the first time. "I left this company to raise my daughter after I buried her mother. You stayed to sell what her mother believed in. Don't confuse those two things." In the fifth minute, he set an appendix in front of Simone bearing an electronic version of her own signature, a clause she had never seen in any summary Preston had walked her through. Her hand began to tremble as she read it. For the first time, she understood with a slow, final clarity that she hadn't been steering anything. She had been the name at the front of the boat, while someone else quietly turned the wheel. In the sixth minute, Caleb drew out the founder's emergency reinstatement clause, written into the company's charter on the night it was first incorporated, allowing the founder to reclaim operational authority immediately if the company was found to be the target of fraud, undervalued sale, or betrayal of its founding mission. He took out a silver pen that had belonged to Vivian and signed the reinstatement order in front of every witness at the table. That card in his pocket, the one he had carried unused for 5 years, without ever quite letting himself forget why, had finally found the exact morning it existed for. He laid down a stack of termination notices. Preston Vale, Grady Cole, and every director whose name appears in these appendices, your operational authority ends now. Grady shouted that this was illegal. Preston threatened lawsuits. Caleb answered without ceremony. Sue, discovery will let the country know exactly what you've done. Security came into the room, but this time they walked past Caleb entirely and toward Preston, Grady, and the named directors instead. As Grady was walked past the glass wall, He saw Nora standing beside Louise, no longer crying, watching him go by with the steady look of a child who didn't understand everything, but understood enough to know that something in the world had shifted. When the room finally emptied, the silence stayed behind. Nobody applauded. Nobody dared speak first. The reversal had taken 6 minutes, but the consequences would unfold for months. Simone didn't weep, didn't plead, didn't rush to apologize. She was a proud woman, and pride doesn't crack easily, but the composure that had held her face together for years had a visible fracture through it now, and something different was beginning to show through the seam. She looked at the documents scattered in front of her, then through the glass at the bench where Nora still stood beside Louise. "How much did you know?" Caleb asked her, evenly. Simone was quiet for a long moment. "Not enough. That was my failure." It didn't erase the harm she'd let happen. It told him, at least, what kind of person she actually was underneath the coldness she'd built for herself. The news leaked within 20 minutes. Someone in that room had typed fast, and the financial press didn't need much coaxing after that. The reclusive founder had walked back into his own building, unrecognized, and cleared out his executive floor before lunch. Stock dropped before the closing bell. Some employees believed Caleb had just saved the company. Others believed he'd lost whatever remained of his judgment. Preston and Grady fought back hard through counsel, hinting publicly that Caleb had acted out of grief, not reason, and that bringing his own daughter into the lobby that morning had only ever been a staged bid for sympathy. Caleb had won the boardroom. He had not yet won anything past it. That evening, he didn't go home. Nora fell asleep on a couch in a side office, the rabbit tucked against her chest, and Louise brought a blanket in without a sound and laid it over her. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched his daughter sleep, and asked himself, honestly, if it had been wrong to bring her. Then he remembered the look on her face when the laughter came through the glass, and he understood that if he'd stayed silent that morning, she would have grown up remembering that her father bowed his head to people who never deserved the room they sat in. Simone stayed too. She pulled her blazer over her shoulders and worked through the documents beside him, page by page, the silence between them tense but honest. A woman trying, late, to finish work she'd skipped. What they found was worse than either of them had guessed. 5 senior engineers had already drafted resignation letters. A rural clinic dialysis program in 3 counties was weeks from cancellation for lack of funding. Small equipment suppliers hadn't been paid in months while their invoices got quietly rerouted through a shell consulting firm. "Why didn't you come back sooner?" Simone asked, low. Caleb looked through the glass at his sleeping daughter. "Because there are seasons where a father only has enough left in him to save one person, not a whole company, too." Late that night, Owen Marsh was called up to the executive floor, nervous, half certain he was about to be fired for the anonymous email. Caleb stood and shook his hand instead. "You did what an entire floor was too scared to do. You told the truth." The next morning, Caleb called an all-staff broadcast to every office, Chicago to Denver to Dallas to Boston. He walked onto the stage in the same charcoal coat from the day before, no finer suit to prove anything, wanting people to see him exactly as he was. He didn't open with numbers. He told them about a garage outside Dayton with a leaking roof, about a woman who sold her car to keep the lights on in it, about a friend who slept under a workbench to watch a pressure test through the night. Then he did something not every founder manages. "I once believed that holding a controlling stake was enough to protect a company," he said. "I was wrong. A company is protected by the people who choose, every day, to do the right thing." He announced 3 decisions. The Ashgrove sale, canceled. An independent investigation, opened immediately. Evidence turned over to the appropriate authorities. The research budget, fully restored, with the rural clinic programs given priority again. Simone walked up beside him on that stage, not in front of him. The hardness she'd worn for years was gone from her face. "I was wrong to think coldness was the same thing as competence," she said. "I let a father get humiliated in front of his daughter inside this company. I won't hide from that." 2 months later, the investigation confirmed everything the files had suggested. Preston and Grady were named in both civil and criminal proceedings, and lost every board seat they'd ever held. Ashgrove quietly withdrew its offer. The research floor came back to life. Engineers who'd been ready to walk decided to stay. The rural clinic contracts moved forward again, and the fear that had lived in the building for years began, slowly, to thin out. One ordinary morning, Caleb brought Nora back to the lobby, not to celebrate anything, but to sit her on the same bench where they'd once waited an hour like strangers. "This is the place I want you to remember," he told her. "Not so you'll hate anyone. So you'll know something simple, that when other people fail to see your worth, you don't have to forget it yourself." Simone crossed the lobby, knelt down to Nora's height, and said quietly, "I didn't protect you the last time you were here. I'm sorry." Nora lifted the rabbit and let it brush the back of Simone's hand. Not a grand forgiveness, just the small way a child says a wound has started to close. The three of them walked together to the elevator, and this time, when the doors slid shut and the panel began climbing toward the executive floor, Caleb wasn't a father being kept waiting in his own building anymore. He was a man who had remembered, at last, what the whole point of power had always been meant to protect. I keep thinking about that hour on the bench, not the boardroom, the bench, and how much of that story was already decided before anyone said a word out loud. Grady never knew he was talking to the man who could end his career with a signature. He just decided a tired father and a hungry kid weren't worth being decent to, and that was the whole test. And he failed it in real time, in public, for free. Would you have brought your kid with you into a room like that, knowing what might happen? I'd genuinely like to know how you'd have played that morning differently. Drop it in the comments. I read every one.